Mrs. Skubik, and this is Forum Daily for Thursday, February 20th. While visiting an air cargo facility in Mississauga, Ontario, operated by the Canada Border Services Agency, Public Safety Minister David McGuinty announced that criminal cartels would be listed as terrorist entities under Canada's Criminal Code.
We're moving now to list, we'll have more to say about this in due course, but we're moving now to list criminal cartels as terrorist entities under the Criminal Code in Canada. This will give our law enforcement, our RCMP for example, police of local jurisdiction, provincial police forces, more authorities, more powers to follow the money and to look and see how criminal cartels are using sophisticated laundering tactics in a Canadian context.
Mr. McGuinty also announced that the Public Safety Department, Finance Canada, our fentanyl czar, senior RCMP officials, and Canada's 6 largest chartered banks are inaugurating a money laundering intelligence partnership. In addition, Canada will be investing in additional lab facilities at Pearson Airport to assist in the war against fentanyl.
And we're going to be supporting the sharing of money laundering and organized crime intelligence between our 6 banks, big banks, and law enforcement, again, to deal with the fentanyl crisis and the trade thereof. Because we know that one of the most effective ways of tackling fentanyl trade is to follow the money and to cut off the proceeds for organized crime, which helps us, of course, dismantle the criminal cartels that profit from dangerous and illegal drugs. This is about keeping our communities safe and making them safer. We're also investing in enhanced laboratory capacity right here at Pearson. We saw some of the lab facilities nearby. There will be more coming to assist in that hunt for fentanyl precursors, the drugs that are used to manufacture fentanyl, with recipes that seem to be changing. So we're tracking this now. We'll be in a better position to track and trace the precursors as they come in from other parts of the world.
Liberal leadership candidate Mark Carney made an announcement while on the campaign trail in Scarborough, Ontario, regarding his plan for the federal budget.
And that's why today I'm announcing a new approach to how we manage the budget, how we manage government spending. And the essence of this is to spend less and invest more. That means reining in government spending so that Canada can invest more as a country. Now, this is both practical and necessary. And I think of it this way, and with the Minister of Small Business to my left and her experience, think of a small business that has to pay operating expenses like salaries, office supplies through their revenues. But then they borrow to invest in machinery and equipment to grow that business. Or think of a household that has to pay for heat and electricity, but takes out a mortgage to buy a new home. It's clear that the federal government is spending too much. Spending growth has been 9% on average over the course of the last decade. And the federal workforce has grown by over 40% since 2015. And the government has missed many of its spending targets. At the same time, Canada as a whole is investing too little. The overall level of business investment has dropped from 14% of our GDP 10 years ago to about 11% today. And that reduction in investment undermines our longer-term competitiveness, workers' wages, and the resources that are available to spend on social programs, including health care. So if I'm elected Liberal leader, my government's fiscal policy will focus first on reining in government spending. And that will help create the room for personal income tax cuts so that Canadians can keep more of their hard-earned money and cope with the higher cost of living. We'll deliver more efficient and effective government, focusing on maximizing the outcomes achieved, not on the dollars that are spent. We'll slow the growth of government spending. We will cap the size of the federal public service. We will review program spending with an emphasis on outcomes. And we'll use technology, including AI and machine learning, to create efficiencies within programs and across government. So as a result, we will balance the operational budget within 3 years.
And Conservative leader Pierre Poilievre is calling Mark Carney's plan to split the federal budget a sneaky accounting trick to avoid balancing the books. Mr. Poilievre said that it's deja vu all over again, saying that Mr. Carney will rack up limitless inflationary deficits that will result in what he calls the same disastrous results as the Trudeau government.
Yesterday, Carbon Tax Carney announced that he was going to repeat the exact same promise that Justin Trudeau made in 2015 on budgets. Get this. In 2015, Justin Trudeau said, and I quote, he will run 3 small deficits, tiny deficits. Remember that? And that would fund the largest infrastructure investment in Canadian history to help the middle class and grow the economy. What has been the result? Well, those 3 deficits turned into 9 deficits. $25 billion of new debt turned into $700 billion of new debt. The debt, in fact, doubled in that time. Carney is now making a promise to cook the books. He's planning to cook the books with a sneaky accounting trick to take billions of dollars of new Liberal spending off the budget records altogether. To be clear, this is not simply about differentiating between investments and spending. We already have that. It's called accrual accounting. Anybody who's taken a high school course in accounting knows that that means that capital expenditures are amortized over the life of the asset they purchase. That exists in the federal budgeting already. What Mr. Carney is talking about is taking tens of billions of dollars of new spending off the books, hiding it from Canadians so that he can artificially lower the deficits that people see reported. But that doesn't mean that Canadians won't have to pay the price. In fact, every single dollar the government spends is paid for by Canadian taxpayers, either through taxes today or inflation and debt tomorrow.
The federal Liberal Party is in its final weeks of campaigning to find a replacement for Prime Minister Justin Trudeau. Yesterday, former finance minister and candidate Chrystia Freeland was campaigning at a dairy farm in Waterville, Quebec. She said in French that she would fiercely defend Canadian agriculture and supply management from U.S. President Donald Trump's trade threats. All of the leadership candidates, including Karina Gold, Frank Baylis, Ruby Dalla, and Mark Carney, will square off in 2 televised debates in Montreal. Ottawa has bought 500,000 doses of bird flu vaccine to make sure Canada is ready for potential health threats. The Public Health Agency of Canada says 60% of available doses will go to provinces and territories, while 40% will be kept in a federal stockpile. It says that the shot is meant for people who may be at increased risk, such as those who have ongoing contact with infected animals and their environments. Risk to the general public is low. Canada reported its first domestically acquired human case of avian influenza in November. Alberta Premier Danielle Smith is removing her government's deputy health minister, but bucking calls for a public inquiry into allegations of government interference in lucrative medical contracts.
There are people both inside and outside of government who are okay with the status quo. Some, either because of ideology or to protect their interests, accept the current results. I do not. I want to provide some more context to this. To deal with surgical backlogs, Alberta Health Services followed the strategic direction provided by previous governments, signed contracts with charter surgical facilities to help alleviate pressure on our health system and increase capacity. And because it has worked, we tried to expand these centres through new competitive bid processes. In terms of the latest RFP process for new facilities, the former CEO of Alberta Health Services made some very troubling allegations. And those allegations are serious and they are being investigated. We have asked the Auditor General to expedite his review so that we can have answers as soon as possible. I also want to make clear that AHS and AHS only was in charge of conducting procurement for these surgical facility contracts. And although they were awarded through an RFP process, those contracts have not yet been finalized, as I understand it. They will not be finalized until the organizations involved have been cleared of any wrongdoing.
She says that Andre Tremblay will remain as head of Alberta Health Services despite being replaced in the ministry. The former head of the AHS alleges in a lawsuit that she was wrongfully dismissed for looking into questionable contracts pushed by government officials as high up as the Premier's office. The allegations have not been tested in court, and a statement of defense has not been filed. All right, stay tuned. Coming up after the break, we'll be speaking to Israel's special envoy for trade and innovation to discuss the return of the bodies of 4 Israeli hostages by Hamas, including a mother and her 2 young children. After that, we'll be turning our focus to a drastic shift in U.S. policy regarding the defense of Ukraine since the start of Donald Trump's second term as president. Terry Glavin from the National Post will be joining us to unpack things further. Stay with us. Forum Daily will be right back after these messages. Today, Hamas released the bodies of 4 Israeli hostages, said to include a mother and her 2 young children who have long been feared dead following the terror group's attack on October 7, 2023. Gazans lined the streets and cheered as the bodies of hostages were transported for the handoff. Red Cross vehicles were at the scene in Gaza to accept the bodies and return them to Israel. The remains were said to be Shiri Bibas, her children Ariel and Kafir, as well as Oded Lifshitz, who was 83 when he was abducted. A spokesperson for Benjamin Netanyahu explained this morning that the bodies still have to be forensically identified.
The coffins were transferred to the National Institute of Forensic Medicine for official identification, where they currently are. The IDF are accompanying the families of the deceased at this unbearable time. The National Institute for Forensic Medicine will confirm identities as efficiently and as respectfully as possible, with the priority being our responsibility and compassion for the families. After initially informing their families, information will be shared through official channels.
We're now joined by Flor Hassan Nahum, Israel's special envoy for trade and innovation and former deputy mayor of Jerusalem. Thank you for being with us today.
Thank you so much.
Now, this is obviously an incredibly traumatic day for the people of Israel. What has the response been from the Israeli public? And does the parading of these bodies make Israelis less interested in keeping the ceasefire going?
Well, I actually think, on the contrary, today has been a very, very sad day. Everybody is in national mourning. You know, and Israel is a very small country. And so when you have a situation like this, everybody feels that these are their children. So there were people lining up the whole way, the whole journey of the dead bodies going into the forensics center, where they're going to be checked to see and to confirm that they are who we think that they are. And they were lined with people with flags and singing songs and mourning songs. And so it's a very sad day to Israel, especially because when you think about it, these babies were kidnapped. The youngest was 9 months old. So imagine what we're dealing with. We're dealing with an enemy who would kidnap a mother and her babies, a 9-month-old, and at the time a 3-year-old. And it's something that is very difficult for us to grasp and to start healing from. And of course, this is an ongoing injury because we still have almost 70 hostages left. We believe half of them are alive.
Now, I want to ask you about the Red Cross and their participation in the handoff. Some have accused the Red Cross of being complicit here and failing the hostages. What do you make of that claim?
I completely agree with that claim. The Red Cross have not done anything at all for the hostages in 16 months. They have not even passed one prescription, one medicine. Some of the hostages died because they didn't get the medicine that they needed. And the Red Cross has been uninvolved and uninterested to help. The only time the Red Cross show up is to become a taxi service to bring the hostages from Hamas to the border with Israel. And they don't seem to understand that Hamas need them more than they need Hamas, in which case they should have actually made more of an effort to be involved with the hostages. What they do seem to always be involved in is the prisoners, the terrorists with blood on their hands that Israel holds. And it seems they're way more bothered by the release and the farce than the farce that the ceremonies of the release hostages do. They stand on stage with Hamas. They sign certificates of Hamas. They're part of the farce of Hamas. And really, they really care about the prisoners with blood on their hands coming out of Israeli jails and their well-being.
Now, Hamas has taken hostages before, most notably taking a BBC journalist in 2007 and releasing him after 4 months in an immense amount of international pressure. Now, did the international community fail in putting enough pressure on Hamas?
Absolutely. And the BBC reporter has disappeared, never speaks about it. And the BBC, of course, forgets that one of their own was taken hostage because their coverage has been ridiculous, to the point that the week that the 3 hostages came out looking completely emaciated, they spent the whole week doing damage limitation for Hamas as if they were their propaganda arm, saying that the prisoners in Israeli jails also looked emaciated. They couldn't find one picture of an emaciated prisoner because most of them, all of them, are getting 3 square meals a day because Israel actually abides by its international obligations of the Geneva Convention. So yes, the BBC has completely forgotten that one of their own was taken hostage. It was the international pressure that got him released, and they have done nothing except blame Israel for a war we didn't start and for a massacre that we certainly didn't want.
Now, Hamas is claiming, without evidence so far, that the Bibas family were killed in an Israeli airstrike. Now, do we know if this is true, and does it matter given that they were celebrating around the coffins?
We don't know this true. The Hamas are genocidal terrorists who lied. They actually asked one of the female hostages to stage her own death in order to do psychological warfare on her parents and her family and the country. Daniela Gilboa, she talks about it. And so how could you believe a genocidal terrorist group? But ultimately, they're to blame. Israel started attacking in order to get back our hostages, in order to get back our deterrents from a genocidal group that has in its charter to destroy Israel. So whatever happened, Hamas is to blame for taking babies from their cribs as hostages.
Now, in regards to the crowds that surrounded the coffins, at many points seeming to celebrate their deaths, how should the international community understand what the views of Gazans are?
Well, I think it's very clear what the views of Gazans are. We saw it from the beginning of the hostage release, when you saw a bunch of gangster terrorists surrounding these women who looked so helpless. We saw them push around and harass an old man when he was released. And now we've seen them celebrate 4 coffins. And we don't just see adult men, we see women, we see children, we see the whole family. And this is part of the death cult, the terrorist cult, that gives us very little hope for any type of peaceful resolution with them in the near future.
Well, this it hasn't been released yet, but what will the next phase of the ceasefire look like? And as I mentioned, obviously Israel is not happy with the outcome right now. 2 children's bodies were just returned to Israel. So, what is the reaction from Israel right now going into this next phase?
Again, it's so difficult to do a deal essentially with the devil, which is what we did and what we're going to have to continue to do. What Hamas want is clear. They want the end of the war. We want the end of Hamas's rule, but we also want the hostages back. And this is the dilemma that we find ourselves in. Are we going to have to completely stop the war to get our hostages back? That's what they want. I think Israel has to do everything that it can to get our hostages home, including stopping the war. And if we have to go back to it at a future time, then we should. But we should get all those living hostages home. And if we can, of course, the dead ones, so that their families can put them to rest.
And in this situation, is a ceasefire the answer? Is that what's going to bring the most peace in the long run?
Well, this is a Sophie's choice that Israel has. That's the choice that we've had. Is it smart to release 40 prisoners for every 40 terrorists for every hostage? Terrorists with blood on their hands, terrorists who've gone back to terrorism. 80% of the terrorists released in deals go back to terrorism. Is that smart? No, it is not a deal, it's an extortion. But Israel has a very strong ethos that no man or woman is left behind. The government let down those people on October 7th. And so we have a moral and ethical obligation to bring them home. And what happens after that has to be the government's resolve. But at the moment, the priority should be getting everybody home at whatever price. We can come back to whatever it is that we're doing afterwards.
Thank you so much for the time today.
Thank you.
All right, coming up next, we'll be speaking to Terry Glavin from the National Post to discuss the radical shift in America's policy towards Ukraine at the hands of U.S. President Donald Trump. Mr. Trump went so far as to imply that Ukraine was at fault for starting the ongoing war with Russia and that Ukraine's president is a dictator because the country hasn't had an election during the war. After that, we'll have more news from across Canada and around the world. Stay with us. We'll be right back. U.S. President Donald Trump has radically shifted U.S. policy towards Ukraine, going so far as to imply that it was Ukraine that started the war.
But today I heard, oh, well, we weren't invited. Well, you've been there for 3 years. You should have ended it 3 years. You should have never started it. You could have made a deal. I could have made a deal for Ukraine that would have given them almost all of the land, everything, almost all of the land, and no people would have been killed, and no city would have been demolished, and not one dome would have been knocked down.
And yesterday, the president implied that Ukraine's President Zelensky is a dictator because Ukraine hasn't held an election during the war. And with this shift, political leaders are starting to push back. Senate Democrat Chuck Schumer responded, calling Mr. Trump's comments disgusting.
In a Fox interview released last night, President Trump spoke about the war in Ukraine. And some of his comments sounded straight from a Russian propaganda playbook. Rather than speak the truth, rather than acknowledge Vladimir Putin's role in starting this war, President Trump amazingly blamed Ukraine for Putin's invasion. To quote the president, "You should never have started it," he said. He was saying that to President Zelensky. This is disgusting, disgusting, after how this man has fought so hard and so valiantly. And it deliberately distorts the truth. It's disgusting to see an American president turn against one of our friends and openly side with a thug like Vladimir Putin. It's shameful to hear the president repeat Putin's propaganda while laying the groundwork for negotiations that favor Russia at Ukraine's expense. The people of Ukraine did not start this war. Vladimir Putin did.
Both Prime Minister Trudeau and Foreign Affairs Minister Melanie Joly have said that Ukraine must have a seat at the table in any peace talks, and the Prime Minister said that Canada will continue to stand by Ukraine.
Ukrainians have been fighting and dying not just to protect their sovereignty, their territorial integrity. They're also fighting to protect the rules-based order that keeps us all safe around the world, and has for close to 80 years now. This period of peace, stability, prosperity for the world happens because we had rules around borders, around not invading your neighbors, that Russia chose deliberately to violate a number of years ago. That is why Canada and our allies are unequivocal on standing up against Vladimir Putin's illegal, immoral, unjust violations of the international order.
We are now going to bring in Terry Glavin from the National Post for more on what happens next for Ukraine. Terry, thank you for joining me today.
Good to be here.
Now, what do you make of Trump's wild comments here on Ukraine, and why are his views so warped on who the aggressor is?
Well, I think actually Zelensky had it right yesterday, I suppose, when he said that Trump lives inside a kind of Russian disinformation bubble. You know, it's not a pleasant thing to say, but I don't think the president of the United States has a very firm grasp on sanity. I really do think that he's lost it. And this, I mean, a lot of people would like to imagine that he's playing some kind of 4D chess and all this sort of thing. I'm sorry, you know, this is the most perilous moment that the liberal democracies of the world have reached in the last 76 years. It is really bad. And all of the arguments that might be made about how, you know, well, we haven't sufficiently contributed to NATO and the Americans are just tired of carrying the burden. I'm getting a little bit tired of this. I mean, we all know that Canada, for instance, hasn't paid much attention to defense spending over the years. But it doesn't matter. I mean, we could spend 5% of our GDP on defense. It wouldn't make any difference. We could have 1,000 fentanyl czars. We could have Black Hawk helicopters patrolling the border. We could, you know, all of these things that we've been imagining are Trump's genuine grievances. I think we really have to give our head a shake. There's something deeply, deeply disturbed about the man. And there is also, you know, the American order is collapsing, and it has been for some time. The United States has been in retreat for quite a while now. For the past 17 years, liberal democracy has been retreating around the world. So, you know, we've come to this point, and I think my main concern is that Canada does need to reach out to its allies, primarily in Europe, but there's also Japan and South Korea, and I would argue even Taiwan. And we need to say, all right, you know, we got a crazy guy running the show here. Those days are over. What are we going to do? How do we defend ourselves? How do we protect ourselves?
Now, you've called Trump's position here similar to Neville Chamberlain appeasing Hitler prior to World War II. Can you walk us through that comparison?
Yeah, I actually gave Neville Chamberlain cut him a bit of slack here. I mean, the thing about Chamberlain in 1938 is that he went to Munich, and I mean, I know a lot of people have been using this analogy in the last few days. He went to Munich and he made an arrangement with Mr. Hitler, allowing Hitler to take the Sudetenland of Czechoslovakia in return. Britain would not honor any of its sort of defense guarantees and security guarantees in Europe if Hitler would just stop there. Okay. Well, you know, within a year or so, Hitler had taken the rest of Czechoslovakia and he invaded Poland. I think the thing about Neville Chamberlain is that he genuinely thought that he was buying time, that Britain was not prepared for war. And so, and in fact, Winston Churchill gave him credit for this later. Neville Chamberlain didn't join the other side. He was not on the other side. Donald Trump is on the other side. And we really have to get that into our heads here. You know, we keep referring to these peace talks. These aren't peace talks. And, you know, it's almost euphemism. It's almost a euphemism to say that Ukraine should be at the table. This is about the normalization of relations between the United States and Vladimir Putin's Russia at the expense of the entire liberal democratic order. He doesn't want it. He doesn't believe in it. I think the penny needs to drop. We need to come face to face with it.
And does Trump's position here pretty much guarantee that Ukraine is going to have to give up some of its territory in the East?
It's more than that. I mean, even before these so-called negotiations began, Trump had a conversation with Putin, one of many, many conversations that he's had with him. Putin said, this is what I want. So basically, Trump said, this is what we're going to do. Ukraine's territorial integrity has been renounced, abandoned, not going to be there. This is the American side, mind you, which is the same as the Russian side. The Russians get to keep Crimea, which they invaded and annexed in 2014. They get to keep all of the territories that they seized in 2014 and since. That's about a fifth of Ukraine. Ukraine's sovereignty will be curtailed. Ukraine will not be permitted to join NATO. I'm not sure that Ukraine will be allowed to join the European Union. All of Ukraine's mineral resources will be given over to the United States for their direct control or their capacity to assign mineral rights and so on. They're basically dividing up Ukraine between them.
So Trump has been quite hard on Canada recently, too. Do you think Canada should temper their response to Trump, given the looming threat of tariffs, and who knows kind of what else he has in store?
There's a genuine argument that we need to keep our heads down, and we need to hope that he's distracted by other preoccupations and what have you, until maybe light starts to come at the end of the tunnel, when the United States manufacturers and people, particularly in the oil industry, tell him that these tariffs are insane and you need to stop doing this. It's hurting our people. You can't just tear up the auto pact overnight. It's 60 years old. And maybe wait until the midterms, when Congress might be able to restrain him a little bit. And I respect that opinion, but in the meantime, the damage that he is doing is much of it may be irreparable. My own view is that we Melanie Joly.
Harry, I'm sorry, I do have to interrupt you. We've ran out of time, but thank you so much for your time today.
Okay.
We appreciate it.
Okay.
Thank you.
Nice talking to you.
As America's new president threatens Canada with hefty tariffs and muses about absorbing us into a 51st state, a new Leger online poll suggests 20% of Canadians are now seeing the U.S. as an enemy country. 30% of respondents said they see America as an ally. A Leger executive said that he was surprised to see Canadians so divided on that front when the U.S. has been a strong ally for such a long time. Only 1% of the 1,000 Americans surveyed told Leger that they consider Canada an enemy country, while 56% said they view Canada as an ally. The list of Canadian goods that could be affected by potential American tariffs grew last night when U.S. President Donald Trump suggested he's thinking about a 25% levy on lumber and forest products. Speaking to reporters on Air Force One en route from Florida to Washington, Mr. Trump said that his administration was looking at imposing that levy sometime in April. Earlier this month, Mr. Trump paused until March 4th his planned tariffs on all Canadian goods and energy, and then said tariffs on steel and aluminum would hit in mid-March. President Donald Trump says he likes the idea to give some of the savings from Elon Musk's Department of Government Efficiency back to U.S. citizens as a kind of dividend. He expressed support twice on Wednesday, first at an investment conference in Miami and later on Air Force One on the flight home to Washington.
Sir, Elon Musk is proposing potentially giving money to Americans based on what Doge is finding. Do you have any thoughts on that?
I love it. A 20% dividend, so to speak, for the money that we're saving by going after the waste and fraud and abuse and all of the other things that are happening. I think it's a great idea.
How much money do you think?
Could be a lot. I mean, if it's 20%, we'd give back a lot of money to the taxpayer. And also it would give an incentive for the taxpayer to go out and report things to us where we can save money.
Earlier in the day in Miami, Mr. Trump said some of the savings produced by Doge's cost-cutting efforts would also be used to pay down the country's debt.
And saving taxpayers billions and billions of dollars every single day. And there's even under consideration a new concept where we give 20% of the Doge savings to American citizens and 20% goes to paying down debt, because the numbers are incredible, Elon. So many billions of dollars, billions, hundreds of billions. And We're thinking about giving 20% back to the American citizens and 20% down to pay back debt and pay down debt, which is, if you look at value, if it were a real estate balance sheet, the debt is tiny, but we still want to pay it down. Doesn't matter.
Donald Trump said Elon Musk would be checking out Fort Knox to make sure the gold is still there. Mr. Musk has been raising questions about the issue for several days on X.
We're going to go into Fort Knox to make sure the gold is there.
Are they going to?
You know that we're going to go into Fort Knox. Do you know about that?
Sir,
That was a bad bump.
are they going to eliminate more national security positions, civilians there?
We'll see what happens. But one of the things we do want to look, I mean, we hope everything's fine with Fort Knox, but we're going to go to Fort Knox, the fabled Fort Knox, to make sure the gold is there.
Where would the gold have gone? Brought up.
If the gold isn't there, we're going to be very upset.
Mr. Trump made the comment on Air Force One. However, Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent told a Wisconsin talk show host that the gold is audited every year and that all of it is present and accounted for.
Have to ask you, sir, the question that everybody wants to know from the Treasury Department: is there actually still gold in Fort Knox?
We do an audit every year, so the audit that ended the year September 30th, 2024, all the gold is present and accounted for.
Okay, because this is something that people are apparently very concerned about. Elon Musk has been promising to verify that the gold is still there.
And I would invite any of the senators, especially your home state senator, Ron Johnson, who I'm a big fan of, that any senator, if they call the Treasury, we're happy to arrange a visit. They can do an inspection.
Authorities said that a mid-air collision involving two small planes in southern Arizona killed 2 people Wednesday morning. Federal air safety investigators said that each plane had 2 people aboard when they collided near Marana Regional Airport on the outskirts of Tucson. The National Transportation Safety Board said that one plane landed uneventfully and the other hit the ground near a runway and caught fire, citing preliminary information before its investigators had arrived. It also follows 4 major aviation disasters that have occurred in North America in the last month. The crashed Delta Airlines jet has been cleared from a runway at Toronto's Pearson International Airport. The airline says removing the wreckage took several hours yesterday. Delta says it could be weeks before bags from the plane are returned to their owners because of the inspection and cleaning process. The airline has offered $30,000 U.S. in compensation to all 76 passengers who were on the plane in Monday's crash landing, saying the money has no strings attached. The chances of being in a plane crash remain slim to none, but psychologist Steve Jourdain says that this week's plane crash at Toronto Pearson Airport will likely cause air travelers to think twice about flying in the short term. He joined us earlier to explain the psychological impact of plane crashes.
Of course, anytime any of us fly, and partly on our mind is, hey, this is a potentially dangerous activity. But then if you really ask, how do people estimate how dangerous it is? We know from psychology that they don't tend to go with real stats and stuff. They rather use certain what we call heuristics. And one of them is called the availability heuristic. And the idea there is, if I asked you how many red cars there are, the first thing would be, how many red cars come to mind for you? Do you have a lot of neighbors with red cars? Do you see them in your neighborhood? If they come to mind easily, then you think, oh, there's a lot out there. And if they don't, you think not much. So with a plane issue, it's like, how many plane crashes kind of come to mind if I'm about to board a plane? And especially recently, with there being quite a few in a row, and especially given the coverage, which we could talk about. I watched the Toronto plane crash 9-10 times already. So you've seen it over and over again. That makes it very easy to come to mind. And so what that means is a lot of travelers now have an increased feeling of how risky it is, because it's so easy to imagine these situations that they now feel like, oh, it's potentially very, very dangerous, and they're overestimating that danger. It really, it is driven by seeing it. And so when we see it on the media over and over and over again, the more that we see it, the more readily it comes to mind. And there are also other factors. And in this case, there's sort of an interesting one, that notion of being stuck in your seat upside down, hanging from, the ceiling, so to speak. And then and when we really think about it, these people already went through a horrific experience. They probably thought they were going to die, but now it comes to a stop. They want to get out of the plane, but in order to do that, they have to flip that buckle and go crashing to the ground. And that image, we can all imagine how horrific that is. in the area of memory, we call that bizarre imagery. When we have this image of something very unusual, it really is distinguished in memory and has an especially large effect. So this crash, because of some of those bizarre characteristics, will probably come to mind very readily for people. And so I think it could be quite enduring. And especially given all the other stress people are dealing with right now, I'm betting a lot of people are just saying, you know what, I don't want to go to Florida that bad, or I don't want to go whatever. It's just not worth it for me at this point. So I suspect we're seeing some cancellations right now.
We also discussed the potential for those who survive plane crashes to suffer from post-traumatic stress disorder.
So we've been largely talking about, people who've witnessed this and what it has on them. What about the people that went through it? I think this is an interesting example for we hear about PTSD, and that D is disorder, right? Post-traumatic stress disorder. And we have the feeling like it's some sort of mental health problem. It's in fact a reflection of the brain trying to keep itself alive. And so I'll give you this little story. Back in the day when we were, say, browsing for berries in some bush, and maybe we smelled something a little weird that we'd never smelled before, and we thought, that's kind of weird. And then 5 minutes later, a predator steps out of the bush, and now we're suddenly in fight flight mode. We either want to defeat that predator, run away. And let's say we do. Well, there's actually two things that happen in the brain. First, we go into fight flight mode, but the second one is the brain says, oh, I'm in a life and death situation. I don't like being in a life and death situation. Was there anything that happened just before the predator that might have predicted it? Anything I could use in the future? So if I get out of this situation, and the idea is in the future, we're gathering berries, we smell that smell, and now we're immediately brought to that fear state. We don't have to see the predator. We're brought there right away. We're ready to fight it. That's PTSD. The problem is in the modern world, the thing that predicts the danger is often random. It's, there's probably not, it could be a song people were listening to, a smell in the air, and now they suddenly find themselves in a life or death situation. There's going to be a lot of people that were on that plane that may have PTSD-like symptoms when they come off, where they can get triggered right back to that feeling. So that's a whole other issue of what it was like to be on that plane and the effects of that versus watching it from outside.
Geopolitics has found a new battleground on the ice as Canada and the U.S. compete in the final of the Four Nations face-off. Tonight's game in Boston is now a must-watch event on both sides of the border, both due to the years-long rivalry between the two countries and the political tension between the formerly friendly nations. U.S. President Donald Trump has stoked resentment in Canada by threatening sweeping tariffs on Canadian products and repeatedly suggesting Canada become the 51st state. Canadian sports fans have responded by booing the American anthem at several sporting events. I'm Teresa Skubik, and that'll do it for your look at national and international news for today. For more news on demand, you can always visit our website at forumdailynews.ca and make sure to follow us on social media. You can also watch all of our commentary programming on the Newsforum YouTube channel. Good night, Canada.